WSDC 2020. Before we begin, let's give the teams a big virtual round of applause for having made it to the break round. So congratulations. So in proposition today, we have the team, the United Arab Emirates, okay, I'm going to just quickly call out your names and just say that you're here so we can test your microphones, okay? So in prop 1, we have Faria. Yeah. In prop 2, we have Adit. Yep. And in prop 3, we have Rohan. Hello. Okay, with Faria doing the reply. And in opposition, we have the team from Ireland with Jack and prop 1.
Team Ireland are all speaking from the same microphone.
Okay, perfect. So, but we've got Jack, Adrian, and Matt. Perfect. Excellent. So the motion before the House is this House believes that international institutions, for example, the United Nations and World Bank, should only accept female country delegates. Is this correct?
Yeah.
Excellent. So then, before I begin, I just want to test if you can hear this bell. Can we hear it?
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds like we can hear it. Then, without further ado, can we please have the first speaker of the proposition, Faria, to open the debate for us here.
Just getting my pen. Am I audible?
Yes, but just hold it. Wait for 1 second. What is the... Sorry, I think I'll... Okay, perfect. That's fine. Okay, just clarification on speaking orders. Great. So, Faria, please begin for us.
Panel, 25 years ago in the UN Summit for Women in Beijing, the world thought that change was being made. And yet 20 years on, progress is still hard to chart. Abortion rights are still patchy. Violence against women, including rape as a weapon of war, is prevalent. Women in Honduras still suffer feminicide, a death for simply being a woman. And seemingly first world countries, proper economic equality is still a distant dream in these. We recognize that the reason for this stagnancy is because women have never been given a fair chance to change their circumstances within global organizations. And we on Team Proposition pledge to change this. And we recognize that to revert the systemic bias in the past, women need to lead the change. And for this reason, large international institutions should only accept female country delegates. And today we, as Team Proposition, will be proving this to you through 3 main strands of argument. First, on principle, and about how the nature of meritocracy under the status quo is simply fallacious and non-existent in regards to women, and why this is therefore justified in order to ensure reparative justice. Second, why we get better policy on our side of the House. And third, my second speaker will be discussing about how we get better perception of women on our side. But first, what do we mean when we propose this motion? Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to depict the world under the status quo. We recognize, I'll take you in a second, that structures such as the UN have historically been unanimously dominated by men. When the UN first came into conception, out of about 800 representatives and officials, only 4 were women. And structurally, the foundations upon these international institutions have been made both by and for men. We now see the UN, right, trying to combat this, trying to counteract this, and yet still today, only about 30% of delegates in the UN are women, and these women are still not in high-ranking positions overwhelmingly. The UN is literally meant to be this sort of representation of equality and one of the best international institutions in regards of gender equality. And at the point in which these biases still exist, we believe that it is justified to have this motion in place. But I'll take you now.
Would you do this for national and local elections? And if not, why not?
No, we would not do this for national and local elections. Well, we believe that large international institutions should only accept female country delegates. And if you don't send a female delegate, basically you won't be represented. And that every other person underneath these representatives should also be women. But first, why just international? Why just why not just some international institutions, right? We believe that women's rights are a global issue, which has always been prevalent. And the reason that we wouldn't have things such as quotas is because there are unique harms with these issues, such as issues of tokenism, where women are simply seen as sort of this tokenistic representation of equality and are often pushed around and brushed aside by men. But ladies and gentlemen, why in principle do we owe this in women in order to combat historical injustices? We recognize that this idea of meritocracy ultimately does not uphold in the status quo due to two main reasons. First of all, structural historical inequalities against women, right? Educational access has been historically unjust in respect to women. For example, if you look at places like the UK, right, you literally see these high-ranking private schools such as Eton, Westminster, which is all male up till sixth form, in regards to men. And that's why, because of this increased access to education that men have had at the expense of women, you see things such as Cambridge University having all-female colleges in order to actually combat this and have an all-female cohort. Laws which discriminate women as well are extremely prevalent, and therefore we believe that we must counteract this through a motion which unanimously declares that women uphold these positions. But second of all, ladies and gentlemen, perceptions of women which result in biases when it comes to hiring women in these jobs. Women are often perceived as weak, emotional, sensitive, and that's why if we look at women in power, right, if we look at someone like Theresa May, even though anyone in her position would realistically have struggled with the Brexit scenario which she inherited, she was perceived as this sort of weak, fragile woman who was simply incompetent to do her job because of her status as a woman. Or if you even look at women who are respected, right, such as Margaret Thatcher and this idea of her being an Iron Lady, the reason that she is upheld at this high position is due to the fact that she had stereotypically anti-female traits such as being harsh, such as being uncompromising, etc. These are inherently sexist, and therefore it's for these reasons that women were not hired for such positions in the first place. Places such as the UN, right, have been unanimously male-dominated and are still known as this sort of private gentleman's club. Statistically, due to implicit biases with women and gender roles, as well as in some cases explicit biases due to misogynistic rhetoric, men are far more likely to hire other men as opposed to women than women are. And that's why we see this sort of male hegemony and this masculine decline and this masculine sense propagated even under the status quo. And this means that this culture is extremely hard to break. And even when women do get positions of power, there are significant complaints of sexual harassment and general mistreatment due to their positions as women, right? In a world in which even the Indian chief economist of the World Bank reported sexual harassment, we see that the only way to combat this issue is unanimously making these organizations women-dominated. Because as a principle, right, first of all, we owe this to women, because in order to actually have reparative justice, we need to put those who have been wronged in the past in the same position as past circumstances. Therefore, since these were unanimously male-dominated, we need to see a shift. And second of all, having 50% women or having simple equity doesn't solve the issue of women being pushed around, and it doesn't solve the issue of pervasive work culture which still exists under the status quo. But second, why do we get better policy, ladies and gentlemen? We see that other non-gender related issues, right, can be just as well dealt with women as men. They aren't exclusive to men. However, even these so-called non-gender related issues are largely intersectional. Women are far more affected by poverty than men. Women in post-colonial societies suffer to a far greater extent than men, and therefore women experience greater detriments firsthand, even in regards to policies that appear should not be explicitly related to women under the status quo. But second of all, and most importantly, female issues can exclusively be understood by women. And we see two reasons for this, right? First, women actually experience these issues. And second of all, that women are far more likely to focus on these issues, right? In a lot of third world countries, for example, in particular, men are often unlikely to even concede that these issues are prevalent under the status quo today. For example, in a lot of third world countries, they won't view the notion that women are seen as housewives or they're meant to be childbearers as necessarily detrimental, because they use rhetoric such as women are still equal, however, they're just different. They don't actually concede that these issues exist in the first place. But second of all, even if they do, right, there's far less focus on them. For example, if you look at cases such as rape in Pakistan, which is extremely prevalent and occurs on an alarming basis. If you look at femicide in Latin American countries, female genital mutilation in sub-Saharan Africa, these never take a prominent hold on the global scale, and they're never the focus of a country's agenda, which is why we need women in positions such as the UN in these international organizations to represent themselves, because we recognize that empathy is completely different from sympathy, right? Like men might be able to be sympathetic, but since they've never actually experienced these issues firsthand, they will never be able to fully comprehend the extent to which they affect women on a global scale, they will never be able to comprehend that issues that were perceived as non-gender related still do affect women at a far greater rate, and therefore they just simply aren't as qualified to legislate on issues that concern women. And even in issues that don't, women are far more likely to be negatively affected. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to ensure reparative justice for the structural inequalities women have historically faced, we need to ensure that these institutions in international organizations are entirely comprised of women in order to have better policy on our side of the house, which is why we beg you to propose.
Okay. Thank you for that speech. Judges, the speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 56 seconds. Judges, are we done taking down notes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great stuff. For the speakers, would you prefer, in addition to the bells, that I use hand gestures for timing?
Yeah, that would be super, thank you.
Okay.
And could I please have audible POIs? Am I okay to start?
Yes, you may begin. Thank you.
Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, centuries of marginalization of women isn't going to be achieved by symbolic gestures. That's why this proposition has fallen. What is our stance? 3 things. Firstly, these international institutions that they talk about don't actually have a very large, meaningful impact for women on the ground. Why is that? They don't have an enforcement mechanism. These are institutions that you as a country enter voluntarily. They don't have the same kind of enforcement mechanisms that national policies have, clashing with exactly what they say in their first speech. But crucially, when you put women in these institutions, that comes at a massive cost and a massive opportunity cost to the national level. Secondly, although the impact of this on a symbolic level is probably quite large, it seems that something is very, very massive is happening. On an actual tangible level, nothing really changes. You probably don't get a massive tangible change for women because there's no enforcement mechanisms, but it seems as if you've given women a massive head start in society. That's something that is imbalanced. And thirdly, we're fine with equity policies in response to their principle, like having an equal number of candidates, male and female, on the ballot for elections, encouraging women to pursue careers in politics, and that's because they don't have the harms we're going to talk about in our case. Some responses to what they tell us. Firstly, on their principle. To be entirely honest, panel, I think they concede their principle when my third speaker asked the POI and they say they won't do this on a local and national level. How does a principle stand if you're not going to do that on a local or national level? I don't think it stands in any way whatsoever. But crucially, if the principle was sound at all, they would just have a 50-50 split in Parliament. They tell you that because women didn't have the vote in the past, they want to do something in totality. Proposition, would you take the vote away from men because women didn't have a vote in the past? That's something you have to contend with. Secondly, then, on owing something to women, we entirely agree that it's true is the massive amount to women. But which kind of women do you owe something to? Do you owe something to the women on the ground, the women who are experiencing this inequality the most first, or the women who are probably the most enfranchised in society? I think it's the ones who are most disenfranchised. We have them on our side of the house. 2 points. Firstly, why international institutions and women's issues on an international level are being actively corroded by side proposition. Why is this true? A few reasons. Firstly, these types of policies are likely to be co-opted. Why is that true? Panel, which women do you think are going to be chosen for these positions? It's probably the women who are in the party that are currently in power, and probably the enfranchised women that agree with the policies of the party that is most in power. I don't think that's a big issue when we're talking about liberal countries. When we're talking about Jair Bolsonaro, that probably looks like him picking a woman who is pro-life. When we're talking about Viktor Orbán, we're probably talking about a woman who doesn't think that lesbians and gay people in general have a right to get married. When we're talking about probably picking a woman that agrees with the doctrine of Shakti, that is a woman should stay in the home. And then what all that means realistically for their case is that a minority of women's views are being represented. The women's views that are held by the majority of things like being able to get an abortion probably aren't being represented on this international level. But crucially, acts as a propaganda mechanism for the enfranchised, for those in power, without actually achieving anything meaningful for women. Hannah, the rest of our material is entirely independent of that characterization of women that we just gave you, which means regardless of what kind of responses they give to us of that characterization, everything else in this case stands. Secondly, you cannot give a structural critique. Because when we're talking about these international institutions, we're talking about women being on committees, we're talking about women giving speeches, we're talking about women lobbying for legislation. And what that means is that criticizing Saudi Arabia as a liberal country for women's abuses becomes significantly less powerful. Because when a woman is criticizing a woman for abuses against women, it probably doesn't look as powerful. It looks like that woman hasn't experienced abuse. It looks like that woman is representative of society in general. You never get to have a woman from a liberal country criticizing a man from an illiberal country like Hungary for doing something wrong. We think those men deserve to be lambasted. We think we should fill that man with shame. They should understand that they've benefited from abuses towards women. That never happens on their side of the fence. But thirdly then, on democracy, we think that it's entirely fair that people have a right to elect who they want. We think that is entirely independent of their principle, and it disproves their principle also to a large extent. But crucially then, what about issues that are entirely to do with men? They talk about issues that are gender neutral, but there are also issues that exist for men. We think that looks like things like men's health. We think that looks like crimes committed against soldiers in wars. These are issues that are almost exclusively to do with men. We think on a very principled level, those men have some right to representation. Just like we think women have a right to be heard on committees about sexual abuse, men have a right to be heard on committees about men's health. Crucially, panel, though, we think these men should be engaged in the process because they need to understand how they have benefited from the harm that is being done towards women. So what that means then for their case, panel, is that very little actually changes on their side of the house, and you can't offer a structural critique because these things are basically just tokenistic. But secondly, you use up a massive amount of political capital, which is actively harmful on a national level. That is my second point. They never talk about it. They're behind this debate for that POI.
You think that there is no enforcement mechanism per se. How are you so conveniently saying that you'll get enforcement mechanism for actual policies in terms of men's related issues?
I think that's entirely irrelevant, right? You can easily enforce a men's-related issue because countries are just happy to enforce issues that are related to men. Where you need enforcement mechanisms is when you're dealing with policies that might be slightly unpopular in your country. When you're dealing with a policy that the most enfranchised head politician might not want to implement. That's when we need enforcement mechanisms. We have them on our side of the house. Why? On a national level, how are they corrosive on a national level? Sure, panel, we think in the majority of illiberal or slightly illiberal countries we're talking about, a lot of the population might not be happy to talk about feminist issues, might not be happy to talk about abortions, might not be happy to talk about services for women. But we think what happens now is you make those people diametrically opposed to those things because of the fact that you're using up so much political capital, because of the fact that you're making it look so unpopular. Why is that? You create resentment towards women. As a man, you don't feel represented on an international level. That means you're probably less likely to vote for a woman on a local level. You probably feel anger towards the most disenfranchised people in society, the women that weren't involved in this decision, the women that need your help, need your understanding, don't get that understanding. Instead, they get resentment. But secondly, panel, there's a massive confirmation bias on that side of the house. And that is because when something goes wrong, it's no longer seen as a political issue, it's seen as a gender issue. As a man in an illiberal country, when I see a woman messing up on an international level, responding to a question poorly and having economic sanctions placed on my country, I think it's that woman's fault. I view that woman as being too fussy, being too bossy, and it has actively harmed my country. That is the worst then in the illiberal countries like Hungary, Bahrain, or Malaysia. That gets significantly worse on our side of the house. But thirdly, panel, and crucially, women are now drawn away from a national level. That is firstly because you're placing women in positions of power in international institutions, which means you just have less women. But crucially, because of the reasons I just gave you, men probably vote for women less often. Some women probably vote for women less often because they think they've got their fill and they've been told to think those things because they live in these illiberal societies. Which means you don't get those one or two women in the national parliament. Which means you don't get those enforcement mechanisms and those focused policies that might lead to a literacy class for women in rural India. That might lead to a sexual health clinic in South America, in Brazil, in the Amazon rainforest for women that need it the most. What they do is that they use all their political capital to get very tokenistic policies through because they think that tokenism is the way to benefit the most disenfranchised individuals in society. We recognized this was an intersectional issue and focused resources on the place that needed it the most, never been prouder to oppose.
Okay. Thank you to that speaker. The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 8 seconds. Okay. Judges, are we ready? Yeah, great. So we thank that speaker. Now we call on the second proposition speaker. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, side opposition live in a fantasy world. They live in a world where women are on the international stage bombarding men with difficult questions. They live in a fantasy world where the biggest issues pressing these international bodies are men's issues that women have no experience with. And they live in a fantasy world where we have a zero-sum game of the number of women we can allocate to these different bodies. Let me take into account what the first speaker of side opposition said in my rebuttal before moving on to my substantive about how we get better representation throughout the political and power structures of society for women on our side of the house. But firstly, let's take a look at what side opposition have come up to say. Now, they start off by asking an arbitrary POI about implementing this motion to local and national governments in societies, right? Now, firstly, this isn't within the purview of the debate, so we're happy to talk about this after the debate, but for now, we're talking about international institutions. But even if you want to talk about what they had to bring into perspective, they said it themselves, right? In these local and national governments, you have the principle of democracy where people should have the right to vote for who they want to. But when you're talking about these international institutions where delegates get indirectly selected, those are delegates that can be chosen specifically to be women without having to compromise on a person's right to vote for who they want for. Because a person doesn't vote for a UN delegate or a World Bank delegate, they get selected. So that's why we think that this is uniquely the institution that should be implementing this motion. Secondly, another arbitrary question from side opposition. Would you take the men's right to vote because they had the right to vote before? Again, it's completely misunderstood my first speaker's argument. The fact that these private gentlemen's clubs like the UN, the World Bank, IMF, have been dominated by men, and because of that initial hegemony of men that has been propagated throughout history into the present day, where, like my first speaker said, men are more likely to pick other men to succeed them, governments are more likely to pick men if men preceded them. That is why we have this systemic underrepresentation of women in these bodies of power, right? And so we talk about things like voting. Women are already represented in terms of voting equitably because there was no zero-sum game of the amount of people who could vote. But over here, there is. So again, side opposition brings up a point that's completely washed. But thirdly, they speak about how a minority of women's views are represented. How things like in developing countries and conservative countries, leaders are only going to put across women who have anti-abortion views or who have, somehow misogynistic views despite them being women themselves. Now, firstly, we're fine with conservative women coming about and representing conservative views, but most importantly, on their side of the house, they have a much worse comparative. They have men who are against abortion. They have men who have no idea what it feels like to be put into a sexual harassment situation. They have men who have no idea what it's like to have a sister shipped off to be married as a child. And so even if you have conservative women on our side, you have women who are more empathetic to the general issues facing females today that they don't have on their side of the house regardless. So in the comparative, we have more empathetic policy for women, even if in their worst case scenario, we have conservative women in some countries. More on. They said, oh, we want women to fill men up with shame. We want them to ask tough questions, call them misogynists on the world stage. But clearly, like I said, the opposition is living in a fantasy world. Because today, if you're in the United Nations, you have a 1/3 chance of being experiencing sexual harassment as a female employee. If you're in the World Bank, that's higher. And so right now, women in situations where there's immense toxic masculinity, they're subjugated, they're harassed, they're belittled, and they're pushed around and not given the representation that they should be. They're not given the respect they should have. And so you're having women belittled. And now side of opposition comes up and says, oh, but these women are out there challenging men on the basis of their abuse. That isn't happening in the status quo because A, these women are in lower positions that are secretaries that don't actually get to make the big decisions. And secondly, even if they are in these top positions, they're exposed to this culture of toxic masculinity that doesn't give them the ability to assert their views properly. So side opposition's characterization of, oh, let's lambast that man with shame is absolutely unrealistic. Because the actual characterization we see in reality is that men are pushing women around, men are, off doing their backroom deals in their private jets and stuff, while women are left, feeling second-class delegates, right? Now, next, side, and this is also why we do not support quotas, because 50-50 quotas will often lead for developing countries, like propositions like conservative countries, putting women in lower positions. Women, will be junior delegates. They won't actually be the ones making tough decisions. But if we have an all-women body, women will be the ones making those important decisions, which is why we don't want a 50-50 quota where this toxic masculinity will still exist and where women will be in immense tokenistic positions, right? If there's an all-women body, women will be making these decisions. Further, they spoke about how men's health are a problem and how, we need to talk about the issues of soldiers. We need to talk about issues like homelessness and, suicide that affect men. But ladies and gentlemen, on our side, you can find women who are soldiers. You can find women who are homeless. You can find women who have faced depression and suicide. But you can't find a man who's experienced women's issues. You can't have a man who's experienced sexual harassment as much as a woman has. And so, on our side of the house, women can deliberate and legislate on all these issues equally to a man. And on the massive, massive and important issue of women's rights, men do not have the same ability to legislate as a woman does. So on our side of the house, we get better policy because we have better focus and better empathy for women's issues. And for the rest of the issues, we can find women who can deal with that with qualifications. So again, side opposition has failed in that regard as well. Now, on to why we have better representation on our side of the house, which tackles opposition's point about how there'll be somehow less women, right? I'll take you now.
If you're Prime Minister Modi of India, are you going to choose like a bleeding heart feminist, or are you going to choose someone from the women's wing of the BJP? And isn't that
all right? Understood. So if you talk about conservative women, again, even if you have conservative women, you have women who are still more likely to be empathetic towards general women's issues than a hyper-conservative man. And so on our side of the house, even in your narrow worst-case scenario, we have more empathetic women's legislation, even if it's not ideal, right? Now, going on to my substantive. Now, like I said, we have better representation, better women on our side. Firstly, countries want the best representation possible for them on their world stage. So if we pass this motion and have all women delegates, these countries, especially developing and conservative countries, are going to be forced to make better education institutions for women. They encourage women to get into local and national politics so they get the experience to be delegates on the international stage. They also are going to be forced to repeal misogynistic policies that prevent women from advancing in their career, and they're also going to have more qualified women after they come out of these international institutions to run for higher office. Why is this? It's because these countries are going to be forced to make educated, qualified, and strong women to represent them on the world stage. And so they're going, even for these developing countries, if they want proper representation, they have to put qualified women on these fronts. So we get better avenues for women in power. We have women who are now going to come out of the United Nations, come out of the World Bank and IMF, and now have the qualifications and the international exposure to run for higher office. We have women being encouraged to go into local politics because they are the women who are going to be representing the country on a national stage. And through all paradigms of power, we have women in better representation. But in terms of perception, developing in conservative countries, right? If you see a woman, if I'm a conservative man in India, if I see a woman emphatically defending my views and my principles on the world stage, I'm going to feel like women are less confident, are less likely to be, subjugated. I'm going to feel that women are more competent, and I'm going to feel that women have the right to be in these positions of power. And that's why side proposition makes this case.
Judges, the speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 21 seconds. Judges, are we ready? Just a thumbs up is enough. Yeah, it seems like we're ready. Great. So thank you very much to that speaker. We now call on the second opposition speaker. Here. Yes, could second prop just turn off their microphone?
My microphone is off.
Oh, is it off? Okay, perfect.
Honorable chairs, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, 1 billion women will be raped or sexually assaulted in their lifetime. That's 1 in 3 women. The solution to this is a meaningful, pragmatic change, not tokenism and active resentment. One key point today on how this affects women's movements in countries, but firstly, just some rebuttal to the speech we got out of side proposition. Okay, this will largely be rebuilding the case since we only got a point in the last few minutes of his speech, but I'll also be addressing that. So on this issue of why you wouldn't stand for it in local elections, we think it's pretty consistent that you would support this in local elections. If you tell us that men can't know the experience of women and can't adequately represent women, I'm not sure why you support it in local elections either. So we think you should address why this doesn't apply to local governments either. Okay, secondly, on this issue of the democratic legitimacy of this point. Okay, so we largely think that side proposition have only stood for this working within organizations such as the UN and has largely ignored massive and incredibly meaningful organizations such as the EU or the African Union, in which people are voted into the positions that they get in this situation. You have to address the democratic legitimacy in these organizations as well. You can't stand for this working in the UN. Okay, so on this issue of asking questions of men in this situation and how you don't think it's fair that women have to ask these questions of men in these situations. We're okay if men have to ask men these other questions. The only thing we want to come out of this is that men be held accountable for their actions, for perpetuating sexism in their own countries. We don't mind to ask the questions. We just want the questions to be asked of men and for the burden of sexism to be put on men instead of women in that situation. Okay, on this issue of what these women are likely to look like, which we think has been the biggest class so far in this debate, we largely tell you that their first speech means that these women would be the enfranchised class within these countries and largely support the existing political structures. Why is this the case? They tell us in the first speech that there's significant educational barriers and as well as just active discrimination within the law that these women face. So what does this mean for the types of women that these will be? We think these will be rich. You tell us these issues are intersectional, but just as you say, men can't adequately know the experience of women. We know that rich women adequately know the experience that are faced by women of lower socioeconomic class.
Sure.
We don't think you get this adequate representation at all. No, thank you. And we also think if in order for you to overcome these barriers within the law, you necessarily have to be enfranchised, have political connections, have social connections in order for you to be selected for these delegations. So these countries, beyond this, nothing has been responded to. Our whole first point hasn't been responded to. In that countries have incentives to select women who will uphold these systems. If they have the political capital for these measures, for this discrimination in law, then they actually have the political capital for these women to uphold this system. Okay, I'll take a quote.
You've criticized us for putting forward women who support existing political structures, but it's not better than your side where you put forward men who...
No, because we largely think the face of this issue then becomes completely whitewashed. You never get the meaningful engagement. We largely think this just means that women are likely to be seen as complacent and complicit with their own systemic discrimination. We'd much rather these issues be posed towards men, rather than them simply being able to skirt all their responsibilities and tell us, look, she supports this. Oh, she speaks for all women in our country. They largely are okay with the sexist policy we have. We think this is incoherent. Okay, so onto my point of how this will actively damage any existing women's movements. So we largely think this for several reasons. So firstly, the representation of women on these international stages to expand on the rebuttal I just gave. So in the instance of illiberal countries who don't promote women's movements or don't support women, we will send women who hold these same values. This looks like silencing the selfie-me movement in Iran or silencing the Muslim sisterhood in Malaysia. Countries that already actively silence these movements and try to mitigate their effects. So we think it's easier for other countries to be completely apathetic towards the women's movements and very important women's movements in these countries. So when you don't get the international condemnation or international attention, which is vital to make these movements successful, you can no longer circumvent the existing political structures within these states. It becomes significantly harder for these women's movements to be successful or to get any level of meaningful representation. So this just creates another means and another barrier for these movements and never enacts meaningful change on the comparative to engage in the point beyond 7 minutes. It's worse when women are doing it, when women are seen as apathetic towards these issues as well. Okay, secondly, tokenism. So we largely think we've already proved that this will likely not change any legislation or any attitudes. And we think this just simply breeds resentment. When you have no meaningful change being achieved, it all becomes tokenistic. No thank you. You don't remove barriers. You don't change the experience that women face daily. So sexism still happens. So you largely just put a smiley face on countries who commit abuses. Okay, this cheapens the achievements of women who got into these situations on their own merits. So the barriers that women face day to day are particularly in illiberal countries, when women do manage to overcome these things, they're then put on a delegation with those women who just happen to be enfranchised. This cheapens their achievements and it hides the actual achievements of women when they're all painted with the same brush. Lastly, and importantly, you put the burden of women's issues on women. Sexism isn't perpetuated by women. In order to solve the issues that women face, you need the necessary buy-in from men. You never get that on your side of the house. You simply paint women as perpetuating these issues in the first place. So what is the comparative here? Even in their best case scenario, countries who are making progressions, you'll cheapen these achievements, you'll never address the issues of sexism meaningfully enough for them to be changed. In the worst case scenario, they'll put a palatable face on a country which actively discriminates
Hi, can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to kindly request that the speaker from Ireland please return, because there was an issue with my connection. I don't know if it was the same for everyone else. And repeat the last 15 or 20 seconds of their speech from when they were speaking about how basically the cheapening of women's achievements, and how basically it cut off basically when you were drawing a comparative in the best case of profit. I apologize. Yes.
Okay, so lastly and crucially, you put the burden of women's issues on women. Sexism is perpetuated by men, and for that reason, the solution to these sexist attitudes lie with men. When you don't get the necessary buy-in, when you instead pose these questions to women, then you never meaningfully address these issues. So then, on the comparative, even in their best case scenario with countries who are making these progressions, you cheapen their achievements and you never address the issues of sexism meaningfully unless you actively encourage men. Okay, in their worst case scenario, they put a palatable face on a country which actively discriminates against women and paints women as content with their own subjugation, never prouder to oppress.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much to the speaker from Ireland. I do apologize for that. I think one thing which might help is if you are not speaking in the round, perhaps if you could turn off your video. Okay, perfect. And then I will keep my video because I need to do timing signals for everyone. Okay, excellent. Okay, great. Can we please have the third speaker from the proposition come and continue their case? Thank you very much.
Hey everyone, am I audible?
Yes.
Cool. It's a little rich and frankly even a little naive to hear accusations of tokenism from Team Ireland. Literally the side that says affirmative action is the solution for generations of historical subjugation. For generations of policy making within the international circuit that has ensured that women are left. Basically, we think that the best solution to ensure that representation is better on our side of the house is one where you only give women the right to speak up for women's issues on an international scale. I'm going to ask two questions in the speech. First, which side gets equality and opportunity? Second, which side gets equality and perceptions? First, which side gets equality and opportunity? I'm going to look at two things here. One on the principle, and second on which side gets better policy, more equitable policy. First, on the principle. FARIA comes to you with not one, not two, not three, but four systematic reasons on why there's underrepresentation in the status quo. Which is to say that when a country is told that you can come up with a choice between one person and another, a man and a woman, they're structurally more likely to pick a man. What were these reasons? One, we told you the fact that in the status quo, often there's a perception of women in leadership, to be weak, as often people that don't stand up and hold your country's interests. Second of all, we told you about the historical culture of negotiation. We were the side that actually understood what these circles looked like, where like often the United Nations had like backdoor disagreements and negotiations happening, where men would go to bars with their cigars and basically like negotiate. This was the kind of characterization we gave from the very beginning, which is to say that the kind of negotiation you thought was one that was historically dominated by men, right? Third, we told you that general attitudes, was one where like women were considered inferior because of existing stereotypes that already exist, right? But four, we told you that like complaints on sexual harassment, like 1 in 3 women that go to the United Nations complain about sexual harassment because like it happens in one way or another, often like sexist remarks, things like this, right? Like given this, these aren't the kinds of images that countries want. The fact that like 1/3 of women complain about these kinds of things to these countries means that they're deviating from these problems. We changed this uniquely, panel, because we're the side that makes sure that every single woman is given the right kind of culture within these kinds of institutions. What did they tell you in response? They said, aha, we got you, right? Like, we got women on our side. 2, we have affirmative action. 3 reasons why affirmative action doesn't work the same way our policy does. First of all, we asked them, which countries are the ones that like have to pick women? Which are the countries that don't have to pick women? How do you make this distinction? If it's based on like the developing countries that have to like pick these kinds of countries, if you kind of resentment they complain about, it will probably get worse. Second of all, we think that like still people, no thank you, being ill-treated because of this culture that inherently favors misogynistic ideals. The way in which negotiation works, meaning the women are structurally more likely to be excluded, even if it's 50%. We think if 50% of people are the ones that are like being excluded, that's very, very problematic, right? Third of all, notice that still, the fact that affirmative action is something that like exists on their side is a concession on the principle, because it means that they recognize the fact that there is systematic underrepresentation that they have to deal with insofar as we do it better, right? But then what did they say? They said, aha, we got you, right? No, thank you. They said, would you also do this in national elections? Here's the thing, panel. We tell you that, like in the status quo, the reason we don't do this in national elections is because we allow the chance for women to be voted for. But because of the 4 reasons we gave you, every single time the country had a chance to pick between a man and a woman, they would always pick the woman. They missed this nuance completely and wanted to harp on about this completely irrelevant domain, right? What then did we tell you? What does this mean, Robert, right? It means that basically the systematic underrepresentation that we've seen for the structural reasons we told you about, we're the only side that can actually do something about it. We're the only side that uniquely gets the kind of mechanistic proposal that they can do. Before I move on, sure.
If women are seen as content with their own subjugation, how do you think this will affect the international perception of these issues?
Yeah, but we think, first of all, that's contingent on you proving that they would be content. But second of all, we think on an aggregate, like I'll especially deal with this in like my clash on policy, we're actually much more likely to get more favorable policy, right? This actually nicely brings me on the second clash on policy, like under the idea of opportunity. They finally conceded in their like second speech that their counterfactual or like their alternative was likely to be one where men were the one that were asking men, right? Like, you know, basically their main alternative was, aha, you get to confront men, and then that's going to be like a big solution. First of all, we told you that this was very, very problematic because of 2 reasons, right? We told you, one, it was unlikely that men would even care about issues of sexism, oftentimes because if they're confronted on matters of sexism, they would often see this as a threat to their culture, a threat to their sovereignty. The reason this is different for women is because they're less likely to actually place a greater emphasis on things like sovereignty and culture. Why is this the case? Because in order to even get where they did, they've had to break ideals of culture. They've had to break ideals of patriarchy and basically escape. I think that's why it was structurally more likely that women would care. But second of all, we told you even in their best case scenario, even if men did care and like get up there and ask these questions, which we told you was fundamentally unlikely on their side of the house, we think even then, the fact that they don't put this no thank you, and like care about these other men's issues that they were complaining about, like, you know, that is the point where women's issues get significantly diluted. Which means that we're the side that actually cares about women's issues and do that to like a better extent. And this is where they flip-flop on this idea of enforcement mechanism. Because then first they said, aha, you get enforcement mechanisms. I mean, you don't have enforcement mechanisms to ensure that women like and their issues are dealt with. And then by second, they're like, oh, you know, like basically enforcement mechanisms will exist in the kinds of issues with regards to men, right? Notice we were very clear on where we stood. We think enforcement mechanisms do exist in the status quo, which is exactly the mechanism by which we can ensure that women get equality. right? We're okay with like some men's issues being diluted insofar as the ones that are like structurally the most underrepresented, they're the ones that are brought to the forefront. But also we told you right from first as part of our setup for the second argument that actually other policies are probably a wash because women can do this like in the same kind of way. We don't see a reason why women are like bad at other policies, right? Then what do they tell you? Finally, they're like, aha, you get women that are voting on things like abortion because, you know, they're the ones that are the most privileged in the status quo. First of all, notice this wasn't unique to our side. On their side, you have affirmative action as well, okay, like at best. But also in their worst case, all the men that they're talking about will probably do this to a much worse extent, right? But no, we tell you the fact that women have had like lived experiences and empathize with you, the fact that women actually see the kinds of issues, the fact that they know other people that face these kinds of issues and relate to it themselves means that they're structurally more likely to care. Because even privileged women like face subjugation, but most importantly, in our worst case scenario, at least we help a big chunk of women get more representation. They just support sexism and classism. We think on balance, like some classism, which might be problematic, would still exist. It might exist in the status quo, but that's our very worst case. Finally, on like perceptions. What did they tell you? They said, aha, like second speaker argument, international lack of engagement on female issues because you're cheapening, right? Notice that this is like, because you're cheapening like women's issues. Notice there's a bit of a contradiction with their own policy on affirmative action. But secondly, it was weird that their singular mechanism was literally ensuring that more men come in and like get to have like a say on women's issues at the point where like this international lack of engagement would just get exacerbated because they don't care about these kinds of issues. But also, why are these two things mutually exclusive? Why can't I care like about, you know, women being represented in other fronts, as well as like, you know, in the case of like relations, right? Finally, what did they tell you? They said you have increased resentment because of confirmation bias. One, this was contingent on women messing up. We tell you if women don't mess up, that means you actually have a better creation of role models. It means you have better perceptions. So all the kinds of harms they tell you about like women messing up become like much better on our side when you see women actually excelling. But second of all, even if women did mess up, we say it's okay. You train women. You ensure that more institutions like favor women and treat them the way they deserve to be treated. It means that more and more people come in. But third, even if we do have to weigh between men and women, like and like the sexist man versus the young girl that's looking forward and like treating a woman better, we would always prioritize the young one that looks up to women. So proud of it.
Thank you to that speaker. Judges, the speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 29 seconds. Judges, are we ready? Just the thumbs up. I'm assuming we're ready. Could we have the third speaker from the opposition team to continue their case? Thank you.
Everything clearly?
Yeah.
If any POIs, just offer them verbally, please. Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen. They say a woman lives in a man's world, but what I think is even more true is that the UAE lives in Team Ireland's world. Note that they spent more time talking about men's issues or local and national elections than we did. We threw them out there to see if they'd fall for the trap, and then they spent 10 seconds, when 30 seconds over time, talking about our second point in their third speech. Up until that point, no engagement. They're very far behind in this debate. I'm going to be answering 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, on international institutions. Secondly, we talk about the national politics. And thirdly and lastly, I'm going to be talking about women's rights movements. Let's talk about this international politics, right? Let's do a bit of rebuilding here. They say in their third speech, and they make a big deal out of it by listing all of the mechs, that we don't really engage with their principle. But no, we absolutely do, because the thrust of their principle is that women should be represented. To the point at which that representation is not effective, if it's a patsy, if there are hacks for those national governments, or to the point at which it's actually damaging on the national representation level, which I'll talk about in my second point, that principle falls, right? We are engaging with the principle, talking about the practical realities of it, because that is the crux of the principle. But note that also the principle is just quite bizarre. Why Why do women need to be represented in totality across the board? Yes, we think affirmative action would be more principally sound on their side of the house. They say, oh, you would have like a minor delegation, but like in the EU Parliament, which again they did not address in their third speech and they're completely uncomparative in this debate, you aren't like a minor MEP, you aren't a minor member of the African Union, you're just a member of the African Union. There isn't any tiered system there, so they would be more principally sound like that. But notice, right, that they don't really respond to our first point at its best. We give you three reasons why this representation isn't going to be adequate. Firstly, we told you about legitimizing the practices of these governments. They say, oh, by nature of being women, these women are likely to be more empathetic. But note that this wasn't just the thrust of it, right? We weren't talking about that they're not suddenly going to talk about abortion. We talked about that they would be actively corrosive on an international level when talking about these issues. If you're Modi, if you're the Prime Minister of India, you are going to choose someone from the women's wing of BJP. You're going to choose someone who's not just not going to talk about abortion.
Sorry, Third.
Talk about why it's against women. Sorry.
Can you please stop?
Yeah.
Okay. Unfortunately, I was kicked out of the call. So you want to start at your first minute. That is when you were talking about what was it? In essence, you're talking about the principle, and you're explaining why it is that their principle falls.
Okay, and that was at like 30 seconds, I think? Like that was the second.
Yeah.
So at 7:30.
In fact, actually, you know what? Just restart the speech. Apology. And then can everyone else turn off their cameras? I do apologize. Pardon? Restart from the beginning.
Okay. Have you heard?
I can hear you just fine. There's a second Ireland camera that is on.
We'll turn that off.
Yeah. I'm going to assume that you guys are not cheating. Great.
Okay, so I'm good to go?
Yeah.
Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, they say a woman lives in a man's world, but in reality, the UAE have been living in Team Ireland's world. They have spent more time talking about men's rights than we ever did. They spend more time talking about affirmative action than we ever did. We threw them out there as questions to see if they'd fall for the trap, and they absolutely did, and only spent about 10 seconds in their third speech responding to our second point across the bench. That was a very poor strategic error on their part, and that's why they lose this debate. I'm answering three questions in this speech. Firstly, on international institutions. Secondly, I'm going to talk about national politics. And lastly, I'm going to be talking about the women's rights movement. Let's talk about international politics here. They make a big deal out of their principle in their third speech by just basically listing it out again and not really expanding it and just repeating it and saying we didn't respond to it. Note, panel, that the thrust of this principle, right, is that women are represented to the point to which that representation is a falsehood, which I'll be proving, or it's actively damaging to more meaningful representation on a national level, which we'll be talking about in my second question. We have adequately responded to their principle and we fulfill that burden better than they ever could. But note, the principle is just bizarre, right? Their only response to say that, like, we want them in totality is to say we want meaningful representation. But note that if you're elected to the European Parliament, if you're elected to ASEAN or the African Union, you're just a member of Parliament. There is a system within those institutions that are greatly important. So affirmative action would be actually more principally sound on their side of the house. But let's talk about the crux of this question, right? We gave you three reasons why this representation, thank you, is likely to be adequate. Firstly, we tell you about legitimacy and how these countries will be incentivized to be the most conservative women, the women who are going to put a smiley face on the misogyny that exists within these countries. They gave a very glib response to this by basically saying women by nature being women are going to be actively more empathetic to information. Firstly, this takes this argument at its absolute worst. We tell you the reason why this is important isn't just because we want empathy, it's because these women will be actively corrosive to the image of that the human rights abuses in that country on an international stage. They see women representing women and everything's fine within Saudi Arabia, guys. Please don't ask too many questions. But secondly, though, on comparative, there are absolutely issues that those women won't care about that impact the vast majority within that society. They say, oh, classism exists on your side of the house. But the point at which, right, if I'm an Indian woman that Modi is selected to represent the Hindu Nationalist Party at an international level, and I say, oh, there isn't a problem with the caste system and gender, there isn't a problem like that with my country, or I literally never mention it, never comes out of my mouth, I think to whitewash the issues that exist at an international level. That point, right, you're actively damaging. It's not mitigatory, they're causing more harm than they are good. But secondly, structural critique, which gets another very glib response. They simply say, oh, they're living in a fantasy world where men are going to bring up these issues. Note that there's a spectrum of countries in this debate, right? You're not either Sweden or Saudi Arabia. There are plenty of liberal countries with women in those parliaments who would ask those tough questions in our worst case scenario. But at our very worst, right, when we're talking about men, those men are also elected by women. They probably do care about those issues that they belong to a liberal society. The crux of this, right, wasn't about who's asking the questions. It was the fact that the questions were being asked of those in power. The fact that you're not putting the burden of sexism and institutional misogyny on people who have a chilling effect about asking those tough questions. Never really contended with from Team UAE. But lastly, right, we'll tell you about democracy. Note that this is really important, right? The point at which we delegitimize the democratic validity of these institutions, we're talking about the European Union. If you literally have no representation on a legislative level across a continent because of an ascriptive characteristic because of your gender, that's likely where this parliament becomes tokenistic, where you don't devolve power to it, and these women literally have no capacity to have influence. Note that that is comparative, right? Because there are some women in these institutions. There are women who have power. The point at which you delegitimize them, right, is actively damaging, because even if you have 100 women, if they have no power, it's actively damaging when you have 10 who did. But let's weigh it. Note that even if they have this tokenistic symbolism, let's weigh this against our harms. I would say, right, even if you have slightly more empathetic people in that parliament, it is actively damaging to the point at which they can set up these systems. It's actively damaging at the point at which you have a chilling effect on what questions you can ask. And it's actually damaging when they're not representative. In the only area of debate they want to contend with, we beat them outright. Let's talk about the second question, which they didn't want, which was national politics. Before I do, sure.
You talk about how women in these positions of power are going to have a corrosive effect on women's issues because they're going to be conservative women. Doesn't that happen in your side of the house too, when you have affirmative action, when Modi can still pick an Indian woman to talk about abortion?
We never said that you should have quotas in parliament. We said you probably should have like equal candidates when going for like the European Union, so you can actually make a decision. And the women who get elected, right, by vote veto, then being on a ballot and people have a choice, they're likely to not be, they're going to be far less tokenistic than when you just plot them in that parliament, which is the central policy they stand for. We're not being principally inconsistent. Let's talk about national politics, right? Note that the only way they engage with this, they largely ignore it. They just talk about the international level, the entire debate, is to say, oh, you can educate some of these women. No, Mike, Rebuttal in the first speech already deals with this. We don't care if Modi's wife or like women in the women's wing of the BJP get educated. They probably already are.
Just information.
But look, let's weigh this, right? Because they don't engage with this area of the debate. The reason why it matters more with the international level is because we're dealing with the most amount of women. We're talking about 4 billion women here who live in liberal societies. We have a moral duty to them because you have more impact on them on a legislative level than you ever could in the UN or in the African Union. And lastly, right, note that this is reliant on the first. The point at which, right, we say these positions aren't that important, but the reason why they are important is because you trust those people to represent you on an international stage. You want to see that they're competent and they're a good representation of your country. The point at which they're not, right, that affects national and local politics and the attitudes of men in a much more meaningful way and damages those women. We tell you 3 reasons that don't really get responded to, right? Firstly, right, they respond to the resentment thing in the last 10 seconds of the third speech. Note that just saying women are good at their job, I agree, right? But the point at which, right, it isn't just about them being good. It's also the fact that I literally cannot be represented at the United Nations. I will actually resent women for that. I will actually associate all women with that barrier to entry.
Information.
I'm far less likely to vote for them in a local or national election at that point. That is actively harmful. Secondly, when it comes to confirmation bias, it's the same thing, right? The issue is not that women are more likely to make mistakes. It's when they do, it will become an issue of gender in the way that when a man does it, it never is. I will always be looking for that woman to mess up on the financial committee, and the point at which they do it justifies them to never be on a committee or a national body or in a local election. Thirdly, lastly, right, they just never respond to the fact that if this political capital exists, for this to be meaningful in any significant way, not only do we not want to be actively damaging the way that we're talking about, we want that political capital to be pushed towards local and national elections where it's far more meaningful, right? This isn't a wash. This comes at a direct opportunity cost for something that's more meaningful for the reasons I gave in weighing at the front of this question. But lastly, let's talk about a third and final clash when it came to women's rights movements. They gave a very glib response in their third speech, right? We told you 3 reasons why this is important. Firstly, right, we tell you at the point at which women's rights movements are locked out from these institutions, when they're not given credit, when you pick out a token of the BJP, a token of Jair Bolsonaro, you're not able to get the kind of grassroots change when you empower those women and use that political capital when it matters most. There's a huge opportunity cost for the feminist movement in a liberal societies. Secondly, right, which also doesn't go responded to, to, it is tokenistic, to the point at which you do have women in that parliament. Their achievements become delegitimized. They become belittled. They become associated with that woman who got there by virtue of being of their gender rather than being of their competence. We think that is actively damaging for the women who have meaningful representation in those women's movements. But lastly and finally, right, we told you that we do not want to place the burden on women to justify their existence in these societies. We do not want to place the burden on women to be constantly making up for the failings of men, just put men in the hot seat because they are the ones at fault. Never been happier to oppose.
Okay. Judges, that speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 7 seconds. And could we please have the opposition reply speaker to summate their case for us? Here. Yep.
Dear adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to ask yourself a very simple question. What do you think is more important for a woman in rural India? A Security Council resolution on Syria or the national debate about the gender pay gap and the national debate about abortion? I think by the end of this debate, the answer was very clear. But also, as importantly, how those debates take place was crucial in this debate, and I think we won that as well. 2 questions, international and national level. Firstly, on the international level. What we told you, panel, was that on the international level, this is a largely symbolic gesture. Why? Firstly, there is no enforcement mechanisms. This wasn't really contested until their third speaker said something that kind of tried to pull us into the weeds. But ultimately, it's very true that because these were voluntary institutions, there was absolutely no enforcement mechanisms on their side of the house. But secondly, it will be co-opted by the BJP, by the parties in power in places like Hungary, in places like Bahrain. That means it's a symbolic gesture. And what that meant was that when something goes wrong, you as a woman probably get blamed as a woman, not as a political figure. But crucially, it came at a massive opportunity cost to the national level of politics, even though nothing really changes on an international level, because ultimately it is something symbolic. Their best response to this was really that the United Nations is a gentleman's club. Women are often sexually harassed and are probably in lower positions of power, and that means that our harms don't accrue. Panel, even if it was true, which we think possibly is the case, that we have less positions in these women's of power, we still have the man or woman elected in a liberal country lambasting the man from an illiberal country on our side of the house. And that means that that man is filled with shame for his actions that never happened on their side of the house. But secondly, panel, what's really crucial is that it really realistically was the most enfranchised women from these illiberal countries getting into those positions of power. What we told you was these women benefit from the same things that men in those positions previously benefited from. They benefited from women in poverty. They benefited from the status quo because it allowed them to be wealthy, it allowed them to be enfranchised. And ultimately what that meant was that at their very best, there might have been some more instances of sexual harassment within the walls of the United Nations. And we think that is regrettable. But that pales in comparison to the millions of women living in illiberal societies that are ultimately failed on their side of the house. And what that mattered for then was that you probably never have that illiberal man question his views, but crucially, they lost a massive amount of political capital on what ultimately was a very symbolic gesture. So I think we won that clash because at least we had that illiberal man question his views. But even if you don't, it pales in comparison just on the numbers on the national level. On the national level, they really didn't deal under the last 10 seconds of their third speech, but we contested it anyway. They told us there was a confirmation bias. That was the only part they addressed. And we think that that wasn't true to the extent they said it was, because firstly, based on the nature of these societies, men probably vote significantly more. Men vote significantly more in those societies. Even if you have women forgiving women, it is ultimately the men that are voting in those societies, ultimately the men, voting men on the national level into power because of that opportunity cost. But secondly then, men just resent women a lot more on their side of the house because women are in the international symbolic positions of power, which means you've got less women on a local level. And what that meant for the debate was that, sure, they might have more women in the United Nations, but we had women that were not as enfranchised the same way their women were, but were just popular in their community, getting elected to a council, getting elected to a parliament. And that meant that you probably had more literacy classes on our side of the house. You had a better, more constructive debate on the gender pay gap. You had some laws reducing the impacts and harms of sexual harassment on the most disenfranchised individuals in this debate. That was something they never achieved. Sure, they might have the people in the United Nations. They might give an enfranchised woman a better job. They might even have some kind of resolution be passed within the walls of New York. But they just didn't get the benefits that we got for women in India, for women in Hungary. That's why we won this debate.
Okay, thank you very much to that speaker for their speech. To judges, the speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 7 seconds. I now call on the proposition reply speaker to summate the debate for us here. Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, Team Ireland's case is rooted in deep contradiction, right? They talk about how they don't want resentment for women in places of power, but they have affirmative action and quotas on their side for 50-50 equity, in the words of their second and first speaker. They say they don't want tokenistic women in third world countries, but they get tokenistic women on their side of the house, except on their side of the house, they have tokenistic women pushed around by men. Side opposition hasn't dealt with a single one of their contradictions in the case of affirmative action, but let's take a look at that in today's reply. But firstly, side opposition, so in the third speech and the reply speech, failing to get any ground for their substantives, has started focusing on local and national elections being the crux of their case, besides, regardless of them only spending a few seconds on it in their first and second speech. Again, like we said, on our side of the house, when you have more positions, more women in these positions of international power, when you have more women who have gone through the United Nations, then you can have more women to run for these offices of national and local importance, right? On their side of the house, they make the assumption that the reason women don't get voted into the office is because every voter is sexist. No, it's because we don't have enough qualified women. We don't have enough, representation of women in these positions of power, and that norm is changed on our side of the house. On their side of the house, they just hope the status quo fixes itself for women, and they give no substantiation as to how. Secondly, they somehow kept talking about the fact that there's no actual change in these international bodies and women don't have any power. Again, responded to throughout all three of our speeches, but I'll do so again. The bodies that we're talking about, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, these bodies bring about actual change. The World Bank gives billions of dollars of loans to developing countries. The UN has emancipated millions of women in India and in Africa. And so side opposition gave us no substantiation about how these women will bring about no change. On our side of the house, these women will be making these important decisions that affect millions of women and men. Secondly, side opposition's case was focused on this affirmative action countermodel. The fact that the second and first speaker said that we can do 50-50 equity. Notice how this contradicts their resentment point, because men are going to think that women are only here because of the affirmative action. And so the fact of resentment isn't even an exclusive harm on their side of the house. But secondly, they speak about tokenism. Tokenism is a problem on their side of the house because on their side of the house, you have 50% of men and 50% of women coming from developing countries. And these developing countries can very easily put these 50% of women in junior positions, in positions where actual power isn't allocated to them. And so these places actually get a smiley face, and the 50% of men run the shots while women are there making no actual decisions. So tokenism is an actually exclusive harm on their side of the house, because on our side of the house, we have women making actual decisions, right? Now, next, let's talk about their entire point about how we put a smiley face for countries of misogyny. Again, this happens on their side of the house with affirmative action, something they failed to respond to throughout. They spoke about how Modi can put in an anti-abortion woman and argue that on the floor of the UN. That can happen on their side of the house as well. And so again, no exclusive harm on their side. And finally, like I said, these women are going to have tokenistic positions. On our side of the house, we have women making decisions about these important issues that affect them, and have women who can still legislate on a vast breadth of other issues. Now, speaking about the other weird argument about how men and illiberal men are just going to be confronted, something again we responded to throughout our debate, is that, look, ladies and gentlemen, that doesn't happen in the status quo. In the status quo, in the UN, in the World Bank, you have men harassing women, you have men belittling women. There isn't some big, grandiose confrontation of misogynists on the floor of these places. We want to make sure that these places respect women, they give women power, and they make women qualified to run the world and to run positions of power. That's why side proposition takes this debate with ease.
Okay, thank you very much to that speaker. That speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 13 seconds. So thank you to all the speakers in the round. We as judges are now going to request to be moved into a deliberation room.
Thanks, guys. Good to be